Welcome, everyone, to Poets at the Mic with Caitlin Conlon and Morgan Liphart. We're really excited to share this unique format where, unlike most poetry readings where you get a wall of poetry and you might not even be able to absorb it all, we're each going to share just 3 poems. And we're not going to do them all in a row. We're going to split it up. So I'm going to read a poem, and then Caitlin and Morgan are going to get me to ask about it. Then Caitlin's going to read a poem, then Morgan's going to read a poem, and we're going to do this round robin where we mix it up. I'll introduce myself. My name's James Morehead. I'm Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, not Ireland. I've written 2 books, and I will hold them up. The cover for this book is behind me on my wall next to the swords. Swords are another story. And I'll pass it over to Caitlin. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I am a poet that primarily writes about grief, love, family, and mental health. My very first book came out earlier this year, The Surrender Theory, with Central Avenue Publishing. It's a book I'm very proud of, and it talks about all of those things that I just mentioned that I like to write about. So I'm here today.
All right, Morgan.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here today. My name is Morgan Liphart. I'm a poet living in Colorado. My work has been published all over the US, Canada, and England, most notably Pop Shot, which was awesome recently, and the University of Oxford's Literary Imagination. I write a lot about nature, and my very first chapbook came out a couple years ago called Barefoot and Running. And it's about the things that you kind of discover about yourself as you kind of immerse yourself in nature. And it was nominated for a Colorado Book Award this year. So that was very exciting.
So cool. And I've read all of these books, and I just think they're wonderful, and I encourage you to seek them out, and we will pump up our books again a little bit later and throughout. All right, so I'm going to start with our first poem. This is a poem that I wrote recently, and it premiered on the SF Chronicles Total SF podcast, and it's kind of an ode to San Francisco. She is San Francisco in shades of pink and blue, a painted lady with combat boots and attitude. She wears sweatshirts in summer, chilled by salt-soaked fog spilling over evening tides. You might catch a glimpse of her rollerblading across the Golden Gate as you sail beneath suspended steel into Pacific swells. She is portraits in DeYoung, a cable car's clang, a skate punk sprayed in neon green who runs from bay to breakers or swirls around a rainbow flag on Market Street in June. She is San Francisco, spun with threads of sunset hues and wisps of endless dune. Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel like I've never been to California at all. I feel like listening to that poem, I'm getting the tour of San Francisco. So a question I have for you is whether there was one specific, you mentioned a lot of different images of the city. Is there one specific image that really prompted you to write this piece, or was it just a kind of combination of everything that you've experienced there?
So the trigger for this was a couple months ago. I was going into downtown San Francisco, which I do frequently. I live about 45 minutes outside of the city for concerts. And I was in town actually for Billy Collins' reading. And I got there about 40 minutes early, so I just started walking around. And San Francisco went, like a lot of big cities, went through a very rough time during the pandemic with the downtown shutting down and the restaurants shutting down and just all sorts of unhoused challenges. It was just a lot of things. So San Francisco was not itself for a while. And then I was walking around and it was, San Francisco is just feeling like San Francisco again. And it got me pretty pumped up. And then I was sitting in the audience waiting for the Billy Collins to come on, and I just started writing She is San Francisco. And then I thought of all the different, images, a lot of which, people in San Francisco will totally get it, and people outside of San Francisco will be curious. It was kind of my goal.
I love that. I love how the poem feels like it's a real woman that could just walk off the page and like you would recognize her when you see her. My question is, how did writing this poem affect or deepen your relationship with San Francisco?
Oh, it definitely deepened it, and it was very. I actually reached out on Twitter to the hosts, the SF Chronicle Total SF podcast, which is a complete love fest to San Francisco podcast, very positive about all the things to do and cultural quirks and all these things. And they totally loved it, and within a week invited me on, and so that really got me excited. I've also, when I've read this at open mics and other things, people really pumped up by it and moved by it. So tonight I'm actually performing it again at a Total SF San Francisco movie run, where they're doing every couple of weeks they're doing a movie shown filmed in San Francisco. So I'm going to get to read it again in front of that audience right after this is done, actually, which is cool. And I just the reaction from people in San Francisco is so positive. It reinforces my love for the city. And there is a friend of mine who's a real super fan of San Francisco. And so that was definitely in the back of my mind too. So there's a little that person would have a little bit of Easter eggs sprinkled in that only they would catch. Cool. All right, so that's the format for people who are just joining. We are now going to move on to Caitlin to read her first poem, Nesting Doll.
Yes, so this poem is from my aforementioned book, The Surrender Theory, and I will preface it no more. My grandmother's death is a big grief, the size of maybe a medicine ball. Anything bigger than that is no longer grief, it is hopelessness, which is generally much worse. Nobody talks about it being hopelessness without lying at least a little bit. I do not want to lie anymore. Lying is a plum-sized grief. When I was younger, I treated truth carelessly and cannot tell you why, only that the guilt never tasted quite as bitter as it should have. Guilt is a watermelon-sized grief. Premature forgiveness is a peach. There is something terribly fitting about eating loss when you're able to. I have not always been able to. Misplacing love for the first time was a wad of taffy as big as my head. I crawled away with a cavity on my canine, but at least I crawled away. The trick is to stop believing you will come away unscathed and instead prepare for the inevitability of upheaval. One time my grandmother asked me if she was the reason that I was always so sad, and I told her the truth, which was that I don't know why I'm always so sad. What I should have said, what she probably needed to hear was, you are the opposite of what is misprinted in my foundation. But I've never really been one for saying the right thing at the correct time, which of course is why I write, why I'm here at all, meditating on grief, trying to say something sounds nicer than, I would like you to come home now. I would like you to take your shoes off by the coat rack and leave me notes on the kitchen counter. Brag about me to your friends as I turn into a strawberry. Take me to terrible matinee comedies and pretend we both hated them. I promise that if you do, I'll stop talking to loose change on the sidewalk, poking at the birthmark on my chest that isn't there anymore, eating the flowers we once planted so carefully by the big tree. Dolly, they taste so sweet and fresh, like a place I could finally be happy in.
Such a powerful poem, and your love for your grandmother comes through so eloquently in your book. How do you approach reciting a poem like that? And I've got a couple of poems like that where they're very personal and they bring up strong emotions. How do you approach reciting a poem like that where you get through the poem and it doesn't, and all those strong feelings aren't, emotion, and when you're reading a poem, reciting a poem is totally valid and good. There's also a tipping point where it makes it harder for people to hear. So what's your approach to getting through it?
I think what I've learned in the months that this book has been out, and I've been doing some readings of it, which the whole book is kind of about grief and this sort of grief that I kind of wrote about. So I've gotten a bit of practice and learned a lot, which was that I try to focus on the language itself, less the feelings, the emotions, but like actual words that are on the page, the way I have used them to construct these images, I focus more on the linguistics of it than the meaning behind it. That doesn't mean that I don't occasionally read a poem like that and feel it deep in my chest, but I think, yeah, just to sum it up, focusing on the language rather than the feeling has been the move.
Love that. Caitlin, this is one of my favorite poems of yours because it's so visceral, the feeling of grief being the size of something. Is there an inspiration story behind your idea for making grief the size of a plum, the size of a watermelon, like something that you can feel and hold in your body?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was experiencing the grief initially, when I was writing this poem, when it was a fresher grief, I found that every single day it was a little different. Some days it felt huge, like this big insurmountable grief that I could not move past. I couldn't get my way through, to reference the poem. But then some days it felt like something I could hold in my hand and set down and say, okay, not today. I know it's here, but not today. So I don't know that I have a specific moment where the inspiration came to me, but I remember I was sitting in a Panera Bread, actually, looking at the apple on my tray, and I thought, grief today feels like this apple. And then I kind of went from there and expanded it to what it is now.
And we're getting some wonderfully thoughtful comments in the chat, so we are keeping an eye on that and watching. So if you have thoughts or to share, even if it's just something that touched you, please do share that in the chat. It's really cool. All right, so now Morgan, it's your first turn to share your poetry with us.
Wonderful. This poem is titled "For My Best Friend in an Undead Language." And before I begin, I just want to thank you, James and Caitlin, for letting me switch out to this poem this morning. I just woke up and felt like I had to read this poem. So if you're out in the audience and it like hit something in your heart, then maybe I was just feeling like you needed to hear it today. For my best friend in an undead language. The way you move through the world makes me think of rain, taking the shape of anything that will hold you. You are frozen in a moment to me, forever smoking on the balcony, staring at the ripened horizon, the golden hour falling around my hair, your hair, damp from the pool. Webs of mascara dripping down my cheeks, down my chin, to my knees. We close our eyes. We tilt our heads back and try to build a time machine in our minds for a different world, a different tangle of stars. Not here, but somewhere else. I would never love you more than this, right here, under our sherbet sun. I still believe if anyone could outrun the past, it would be us. But I could never outrun you. In your last letter to me, you said, I'm done sleeping with the doors unlocked, done walking downtown through alleys with only the moon and daring someone to love me like this. I do love you like this. Hope is not a dead language. It whispers in our sleep. Do you think we just forgot how to hear it? Thanks.
So I think now for those that are obviously listening here, you won't be able to see it, but maybe hold it up, Morgan, because I got you a question about the form, because the poetry is about words, it's about sounds, it's about how it looks on the page. So talk a little bit about how you approach the look on the page, your use of white space and line breaks and italics, and just go through that thought process for a minute.
Yeah. In this book particularly, a style that I used very often was creating space in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a line. So I hope you can see it. Like, there's space. And that for me was trying to almost like hold the reader's hand and make them pause at certain moments where I didn't want a line break, but I still wanted like a beat, like a breath almost. So like for instance, a different tangle of stars, then I have some spaces not here, but somewhere else. And I wanted like there to be separation. So I kind of used that separation to guide the reader into how I would read it to them. So even though they're reading it on a page, they're still getting it kind of like presented to them in a way. And then I typically do not write with any sort of form like couplets or anything, you know, more formal. I just let the words and like the idea create its own format. I do have italics in this one, but that's just to indicate the letter, you know, that I'm speaking of, to kind of set it apart so that you can understand that's a different part.
And I think that's a misunderstanding of free verse. Free verse is not without structure. It's just not without a received form that's been handed down over the years. It has a structure that the poets come up with for the purpose of that poem. So I knew you would have a very thoughtful answers to because everything in a poem is thoughtful, and it's rare that there's a space or a line break or a word that hasn't been agonized over. Very cool. Okay, so now it's my turn again. I'm going to read a poem from my second book, which came out recently. And it's a little different from the ones we've heard so far. That summer in Savory, Wyoming. Speeding along Wyoming 70 alone in the back of my aunt's Audi. The Savory, Wyoming sign claims population 25. I guess I could meet them all if I tried. I brought my Boston busyness, expecting every minute to be filled. Instead, my cousin spends hours making flies. I learn they are for fooling fish. I read through every book he owns, some twice. I flip the Billy Joel cassette over and over. I'm awoken by a rooster to collect eggs each morning, reaching under the soft of hens. I explore every corner of the dusty, manure-scented barns. I watch a family of foxes pop up, then scurry when I'm hiking near their den. I build a spaceship from discarded wood. I mow the front lawn for an afternoon, amusing my aunt. It was a field, not a lawn. I spend hours spelling horse with a basketball. I silently watch as my uncle bales hay, his crisp Stetson a silhouetted shadow in noon sun. I ask about the cattle guards as we rattle in his F-150. I walk to the general store, searching for candy. I do other things and nothing for hours and days and weeks. When night falls, I fall asleep, lulled by the quiet of Wyoming.
Just wonderful, James. My question is, we heard a poem about San Francisco, and now we've heard one, more Wyoming. I was wondering what role place and location has in your work, because I feel like you have a very strong sense of place in your poems, and I'm interested as to how you perceive that.
So that's a great question. I think it's more that rich imagery plays a strong role. I've certainly been told by people at open mics that at one open mic, someone had their eyes closed the whole time, and I was worried they were asleep. They said they actually closed their eyes because it felt like they were watching a movie. And so I, for whatever reason, I think I have a skill at creating strong imagery. So place is one way of doing that. I also love ekphrastic poetry, and I'm actually working on a book of ekphrastic poetry. So images plays a role, whether those images are inspired, as in the case of San Francisco, with a little bit of personal experience, or purely personal experience. I think my poems tend to start with strong imagery, and then I figure out what form it should take. And in that poem is really a prose poem. It's a series of prose poem lines, very sparse, like the sparseness of where my uncle and aunt used to live in tiny little town. I mean, I was the opposite of that place. I mean, I came in from Boston, go, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So I exhausted my cousin because he was used to being in this sort of much slower pace. And for him, when he visited me in Boston, he couldn't handle the busyness of it. So it's really interesting. I wanted to kind of capture that distinction.
Yeah, I love that. It sounds like this poem is inspired or based on a real trip or a real summer that you had as a kid. So how did you approach writing a poem now as an adult about something that happened so long ago? Like, did you really dive into your memory, or did you dive into more like the feeling of when you were there?
There's certainly the feeling, but I do dive into memory. In my in this second book, more than almost half the book is was a trip I took to the Soviet Union when I was a teenager, and I wrote it 5 years after, and then it took years to find a good home for it. This is a really cool thing for everyone listening who writes poetry or think of writing it. Writing poetry is an amazing memory trigger because you have to relive things, and the more you write down, the more you'll remember. The more you write down, the more you'll remember, and it is incredible, the details that are all there that get unlocked. So I think those are all things I did. I didn't remember them all at once, but as I wrote one down, it made me think of something else, which made me think of something else. There really wasn't anything in there that was purely fanciful. Those were all real things that I found, and then I just found a way to condense them, as poets do. All right, so it is your turn again.
All right. This is another one from the surrender theory. This one is called Penelope. It's with fingertips tangled in crimson thread that I begin to wonder if perhaps I've been too gentle with the men I have loved. Perhaps the waiting, the solitude, the undeniable yearning has been less about holding people accountable and more about testing my limits for sport. I have always needed to prove myself to myself. I decide that I am not a worthy lover if I don't spend every waking hour unwinding my heart under the assumption that someday I'll be held again and this labor will not have been for nothing. If I stop even to rest my eyes, then I deserve all the tangled nets and sea glass that wash up onto the beach before me. Sacrifice makes sense to me. How else do you explain the countless bodies I have turned away, the tired nature of the loom that has become my paradox? The songs I refuse to let any muse sing for me shroud from a wounded tapestry, tumbles lightly over my hands as I work like your hair would in the rosy-fingered mornings before the storm. Everything I remember reflects how I have loved you, which is entirely too much for what was given in return. Is this too soft? If I can bite my tongue without breaking my teeth, is that too soft? If I can turn away from the solace of real company while embracing the ghost of your touch, is that too soft? I look through the window to the night shimmering quietly and am reminded of a curtain thick with steam. The way it sticks to itself as it wavers, it's lonely to be in love. Nobody will ever know exactly how you feel. It's even lonelier to love longer than you deserve to, but how do I know what I deserve if my story is only ever told as addendum to yours? Oh, how I could have had it all. Somebody that would listen when I asked them to stay. I can't explain why I continue this never-ending pilgrimage into uncharted waters. There are things that I will never be able to tell you about grief, but I have made peace with them. I have invited them to watch me weave deception into our timeline, and they applaud me, praise my courage, tell me, of course he will want who you've become, which isn't a lie because I believe it. Belief is critical to those that have experienced loss. For example, I believe that this life as an undoer is temporary. I believe that the gods are not as smart as they think they are. I believe that nestled deep in my throat, there is a part of me that will eternally, frantically search for you in every tide that devours our beaches. A part that knots seaweed into ropes and unfurls them into the great abyss. It's only once dawn greets my skin, as she always does, sympathetically, that I can find enough restraint to crawl into cool sheets and accept the hours I have lost to remembering you, placing my hands vacant and worn on the table beside me. The loose threads from a history not worth writing pool around my bed like a raft. One of these days, I swear, there will be nothing left to unravel for you.
Love that. So many powerful images and the use of repetition. And again, folks can't see it, but the use of repetition that isn't placed in the same place, it's scattered throughout. And I think that was very effective. So where does a long poem like this, where did it start? And did you have the sense that it was going to be longer from the beginning, or did it, is that, obviously it ended up being what it needed to be, but what was sort of the journey of this poem? Particularly for a long poem, the editing process can be tricky because there's a lot going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read the Odyssey when I was in college for the very first time, and I was so struck by the story of Penelope. For anybody out there that might not know, the gist of it is that Penelope is waiting for Odysseus to come home to her, and she has a lot of suitors that want to marry her. They think Odysseus is lost for good. And she says, well, I will marry one of you. I will pick someone once I have finished this tapestry I'm weaving. And she spends all day weaving this tapestry. And then at night, she goes back and undoes all of the progress she's made. Just this constant building and breaking down. And I was at a point where I really identified with that idea of spending one half of your life building something up, making it into this gorgeous thing, and then in the cover of darkness when you're alone, just tearing it all down. I didn't really intend for it to be as long as it became, but as I kind of started writing and thought about my connection to Penelope as a character, it, not to sound cheesy, but it really felt like I was channeling her energy as I was writing that, and it just bloomed from there.
Love that. It's a beautiful and heartbreaking poem. My favorite part is love is lonely. You know, no one really understands how you feel, which is just, so I noticed that this poem is broken into couplets. So I'd love to ask you about form and your approach to form and why you chose couplets for this particular piece.
Yeah, so the couplets with this piece were, I was kind of thinking of older forms of poetry, considering that I was channeling, you know, Homer in a sense. I was kind of wanting to do something that, well done today, was a little more more common back in the day. So that was kind of the thinking with that. As far as formatting overall, I tend to write poems first, get all of the feelings and the words out, and then mess with the formatting later. I've found that when I try to format as I'm writing, it really distracts from the writing itself. So I tend to save that for the editing stage.
Very cool.
Yeah, the form of a poem is a tricky thing. Some poets, like A. Stallings, who I interviewed on my podcast, Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, she uses form as a constraint. I'd say most poets I've spoken to, they find the form that suits the poem, which might be totally different than what you expected going in. It depends. Yeah, it's hard to find a sonnet after the fact, and you end up rewriting the whole thing because it's such fixed structure, but beautiful poem. All right, Morgan.
Okay, I'm reading again from Barefoot and Running. And this poem is an actual letter that I wrote and left at a coffee shop in Denver years ago. It's called A Letter Tucked Between the Cushions of a Coffee Shop Couch. Some days you rise in the morning and your hope doesn't rise with you. Your bare toes kiss the carpet and it doesn't kiss back. There's not one silver strand of a story you can tell yourself that will make it easier to start this day alone, to end this day alone, and to spend your moments in between quiet, soft, and separate, as if suspended in water, sitting at the bottom of a swimming pool. There's no help for that. But the truest thing I know is the light will find you, even there. The bursting and beautiful things meant for you have been running through the streets to find you, screaming nothing but your name. Life works like that. You can never be abandoned. I wish I could take your face between my palms and say, you wild, infinite thing, don't you dare give up. You're only one small soul, but you are so vital. You're a piece of this shimmering, dancing universe, and we need you here. We all need you here, so you can live, even this day, with your face turned up towards the light.
First of all, I would love to meet the person who found this poem and has a real gem that will be worth something someday already today. So that's a very cool thing to do. It's definitely planted a seed in my mind to leave some little sprinkles of poetry out in the wild. I kind of got a two-part question. The first is a quick one. I always give a chance for you to share advice that you gave me, which is the title of the poem is very important. And so maybe share what your thoughts on that, which were very helpful to me. But the broader question is, it's such a hopeful poem, despite, your book deals with a lot of challenges that you faced, and yet you are so hopeful. Are you hopeful as a person and you've expressed that to your poetry, or has writing your poetry resulted in you being more hopeful by the process of writing poetry, having you experience the world in a slightly different way?
Yeah. So the first part of your question about title, I'd love to share with everybody my philosophy on titles. I think you should title your poem something that alone gets people's attention, because when you're submitting it to a journal, that's often the first thing and maybe the only thing they'll see. If you do get your poem in a journal, people are going to be scrolling through the table of contents, and you want them to see your title and say, that's weird, or that's interesting, or that's beautiful, or that's like puzzling, and go to that page. So it's better to name it something that really just grabs you, rather than, I could have titled this Letter, but instead it's like a letter tucked between the cushions, and you're like, why is this tucked? That's weird, and you want to turn to it. So that's my title advice. And then for the hope of my poetry, I feel like my poetry pretty much reflects me as a person, which is, I believe, in really going there with the sadness, and really going there with the feelings, and like fully diving in them. I'm a Cancer. If you couldn't guess with astrology, I'm a double Cancer, actually. So like really feeling the feelings, which are heavy and devastating. And then from there, you can heal that. And like from that base of like not being scared of your feelings, you can like crawl up towards the light. So often my poems, I'll write them when I'm like crying on my patio and like really just having a moment. And then by the end of the poem, I feel like there's this light inside of me, or light inside of the poem. And so my poetry, the process of writing it, is searching for that light and finding it.
Well, I want to share from the chat here. Really needed to hear that poem today. Thank you. So I'm sure, yes, you're helping. Both of you are helping people through especially the themes. So Caitlin, any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So mine is a little more literal. What inspired you to leave a poem leave poetry out in the world? What was just tell me about that.
Yeah. So I started leaving these letters when I moved to Colorado about 10 years ago. And I moved here and I didn't know a single person. So part of it was just me like reaching out for human connection. But then the other part of me, which is the part that has really endured over 10 years, because I still leave them sometimes, is just like the obsession with the butterfly effect. And like, you have no idea who's going to find this, what effect it's going to have in their life. And then like that could go and positively affect something else, and then something else. And it's just like my attempt to leave the world better than I found it in a way that I, can kind of plant a little seed or like give a little bit of hope, and then hope that something really beautiful that I'll never know about comes from it.
Yeah, and that's.
I feel.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to say that I feel like I can envision the exact person that would absolutely need to have heard that poem, and that just made it even better to hear your story behind that. So thank you for sharing.
And I think that it speaks to you not needing to know who that person is, that it's not an ego trip. Once you've tucked it into that couch cushion, you'll never know. And that's okay. I think there's definitely writers that the ego gets a little bit overwhelms the art, and that's definitely not the case. So, and if folks are enjoying the poetry you've heard so far from these two wonderful poets, I definitely encourage, seek out their books. They're wonderful. All right, it is my turn again. This is going to be from my first book, Canvas, the artwork up on my wall. Artwork, just for those that are into covers. Covers super important. The artwork is created by an artist friend of mine who uses a black powder technique where they cover up some of the image and then they put cylinders on top and they ignite black powder, and that creates this really cool effect, and then they scrape off the thing. So it's pretty tricky to get the right amount of black powder that creates the effect and does not destroy the piece of art. Anyways, a little bit of cover history there. Shadows play. The shadow enters on cue behind viewers row on row, hands set, shoulders still, following players' spotlit forms and well-worn phrases projected over the darkened theater. The shadow floats unseen between a couple's hands entwined, a child tugging with whispered questions, and a solitary critic quietly scribbling. The shadow slips delicately along the stage, invisible to the spotlight's tracking beam and illuminated twinkles of drifting dust. But the stage manager, suspicious, is watchful from a booth tucked high above, adjusts her squinting glasses, searching while the apparition plays tricks in the orchestra pit. The shadow, sensing, drifts stage right, tucks behind a gilded throne adorned with plastic jewels, casting deceptive sparkles no more real than a silhouette's touch. And with that, the shadow melts into the stage among the words and phrases, masquerade and dancers, foiled fighters' tears and fools' laughter. Her voice, long since hidden and forgotten, her steps no longer beholden to blocking, her beating heart just a trick of light that vanishes in curtained darkness.
Lovely.
There's some
James. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Caitlin.
There's something very haunting about this piece. I like that it starts off really playful, but then it ends on this interesting, almost somber note. I was wondering if you'd like to talk about the trajectory of this piece, if that was something you kind of intended as you were writing, or if that's just how it unfolded as you went along.
Definitely more the latter. That's how it unfolded. So the where this started is my older daughter was in drama all the way through high school and ended up getting the leads in a bunch of things. She was a stage manager once. My father and mother are both musicians. My father has been involved, now that he's retired, but he was in opera. So I spent definitely multiple of my poems deal with my parents being musicians and the experience of being in a darkened theater watching rehearsals. So I certainly did that with my daughter. So I was just sitting watching, one of the rehearsals I was able to sit in on, and I just had this this image of this sort of ethereal thing, shadow, that's observing the interactions between the audience and the stage itself, the little things that happen during a theatrical performance, the things unseen, the stage manager. And there's definitely a turn where I decided to make it a little creepier And just because of the nature of this being, I want to make it really clear it wasn't a real person or an observer. This was an ethereal thing. And then, then just finding a way to take all these words, and like blocking was a term I wasn't in theater and I was never in theater, but blocking is a term I heard. Okay, I wanted to sprinkle in all these theater words and just find a way to bring that darkened theater experience. That there's this, maybe there's one more way to talk about this. There's, when you're in a live theater experience or live concert or a movie theater that's packed, there is in addition to all the people and the performers, there is this spirit of the theater that is not replicated when you're watching theater over a screen. And I think that ultimately was the real thing, is like, what is that thing that makes a live theatrical experience different? It's this entity that's there, and you feel it, but you can't see it.
That's super neat. I love that premise. So your work uses so much sensory material. It feels like you really pull somebody into your poems using the senses. What's your favorite sense to write about? Like sight, sound?
Yeah, definitely visual imageries, but visual imageries that have a visceral reaction. It's like I go to a lot of concerts, and because I want to keep my hearing, I go to concerts that are pretty loud, but I put in earplugs, but I want to feel the music. Like, that's the thing that is not replicable watching things over a screen, is I want to feel that experience. So there's the imagery, the strong imagery, that's the sort of foundation, but then how does that imagery, make me feel, and kind of finding a way to bring those together in a poetic way. Yeah, it's definitely something that I think about a lot.
Awesome.
Cool. All right, Caitlin, it is time for your third poem, which, by the way, I love this poem. I'm putting pressure on you. I love this poem, but there you go.
Well, I hope it lives up to the hype.
Yeah.
This one is called Ode to Dry Shampoo. Diligent can of oil-absorbing magic. Beauty product must have go-to, keeper of hair care secrets and last night's misadventures. I bow down to your grease-fighting abilities in the name of social acceptance. Silver cloud composed of linings, I'd call you a miracle if I could pronounce your ingredients. The way you nestle into my scalp and tango with my purple comb could put any dancer to shame. Your patience with my body has not gone unnoticed. It's funny how people want to understand your mental illness until you exhibit undesirable symptoms. It's all, let me know if you need anything, until you run out of energy to take care of yourself. The trash bag sits by the door, the bed sheets grow heavy, then lazy enters the conversation, and where can you go from that? Sometimes when you're depressed, you can't shower. By you, I mean I, and by can't, I mean what's the point of being good to your body if your body hasn't been good to you? I mean, all I want to do is sleep. When I'm dreaming, I don't have to think. To bring soap to skin and scrub existential dread away, wash the drain, swallow me up is risky and exhausting. I swear it is. I swear it is. Dry shampoo. I'm trying my hardest, even though doing so puts you out of a job. Dry shampoo. I'm supposed to feel guilty when I lift your cap, press your nozzle. I just want to leave the house without worrying that everyone will know how utterly disgusting I feel. Yes, I know it's disgusting. I know it isn't healthy. Stop acting like I'm ignorant to my faults when you have the privilege of stepping away from this monster I sustain. It's a terrible beast, my brain. If you haven't known depression's hot breath on your neck, I suppose it wouldn't make sense. Sympathy always draws a line somewhere, often where it's most needed. Dry shampoo. In a world that will only value me if my self-destruction is hidden, you comfort me. You never pass judgment. You acknowledge me when I come to you, crusty-eyed and desperate for help. You do something about it.
This is such a powerful poem, in that it takes this very banal thing, dry shampoo of all things, and uses it as this incredibly powerful connection to grief and depression. And I just think it's extraordinarily powerful. It brings that whole experience to life in a way that, So how on earth did you make that connection? I know these things are very hard to put your finger on, but how did you make that connection? Because it's really powerful. And especially the way you set it up, the turn, it's not expected that that's where you're going. You think that it's going to be, just sort of a fun, light poem, and it's not at all. So how did you make the connection?
Well, a few things. So first, important to keep in mind is that I really wanted to write an ode. I had never written an ode before, and I was walking around my day-to-day life thinking, what do I want to praise enough that I would like to write an ode to it? And another thing is that I was going through a lot of dry shampoo at the time of writing this poem. I always felt very shameful about buying dry shampoo and using dry shampoo, because the kind of implication is that you're dirty or you're not taking care of yourself. And it was kind of with the ode, the wanting to write an ode in the back of my mind and using the dry shampoo, where I realized I love this thing. I started writing it as this humorous sort of light poem. And it was honestly in the writing of this poem that I came to this sort of realization, I am also attached to dry shampoo because it makes me feel more human on the days where I don't feel like I am. I don't know if that entirely answers your question.
Oh, that's great. No, that's really interesting to hear the backstory. Yeah.
Love it. I have a lot of dry shampoo as well. So this poem really goes there. It really goes deep, and it isn't afraid to say some things that might make people uncomfortable. Like, you always want to be there for me until it's inconvenient, or until I stop being able to care for myself. And it's a very vulnerable piece, and it's beautiful in its vulnerability. And how was your experience, especially this being your first book, of putting such a vulnerable poem out into the world for everybody to read?
I think the most remarkable part of the experience has been when people that have read it reach out and say, I love this piece. It really resonated with me. Because when I was writing this poem, it truly felt like there was nobody else in the world that could understand why I am so attached to this dry shampoo, and the underlying thing, which was that I can't take care of I need to talk about it. So the experience of kind of putting in the book has been really validating for me, honestly, which is amazing because it feels like it's also validating for the people that read it and come to me saying that it's resonated with them. So it's kind of this really wonderful relationship of sharing vulnerability and then getting vulnerability back.
And I just want to pull something out of what Caitlin just said that's super important for those that are writing poetry or considering writing poetry. Don't be fearful of writing about things that are very personal or very specific to you. It's highly unlikely that you're this magical unicorn and you're the only one in the entire world experiencing something, even though it can feel like that sometimes. That experience that you capture so beautifully and so specifically and unexpectedly clearly resonates. Is a wonderful comment in the chat here. Is that, wow, so intense. I see someone suffering from depression so differently after hearing this poem. It's humbling. So that's one of the listeners. I think that's don't shy away. For poets out there, don't shy away from writing about things that are personal.
Yeah, I think it was it Hemingway that said, write clear and hard about what hurts? Was that Hemingway? That's a quote.
It sounds very Hemingway-ish. It sounds Hemingway-ish, yeah. All right. Morgan, you are going to take us home here.
Yes. So this next poem has never been read before to anybody. So yes, I'm very excited about this. It's called When You Die, It Is All Softness, and it's after Emery Allen. When you die, it is all softness, sweetness, honey, even in the places where there used to be the bitter pit of you. the places that never got the chance to see the light. This light, you realize, it's not outside of you like they've been saying all this time. They're wrong. It's inside. It blooms forward and forward like daffodils under warm sun until you become it completely. You lose your chest, lose your feet, your palms, those wanting, outstretched things, they disappear, fade into light, that light that you've become. And then you see it. It's not like the movie you expected, but more like a lake. This one looks like the lake you grew up on, splashing and burning under the sun. The one you haven't seen in years, never saw again, until now. The longer you look at it, the more you realize that this is how it was meant to be. Your life, everything in it, happened the way it had to. For the softening, the long lesson of forgiveness, the knowing. Your life was one rolling wave, and it's time to let it crash onto the shore. It could not have been any other way. You turn around, knowing you cannot stay here, and see a flood like a person, your person, right there in front of you. You spent so many days, so many moons looking that you forgot what it's supposed to feel like two people born from the same star. They hold you for years, decades, a century and a half, until it's time. You both know it is. But before you turn to melt into something with a different name, they tell you, let's do better this time. This time, when we walk into the same cafe, wearing the same shoes, please remember it's me. Remember, it's me. And they turn to glow in your hands. You choose it. You choose it all again. You have tiny feet again. You have a mouth screaming open with life again. You have nothing to give because you couldn't take anything with you. Just your light and your person. This time, will you remember? Remember?
So excited that you shared that for the first time here. It's so beautiful. Now I have a question about preparing to read a poem, which is a different flavor of that, the one I asked for Caitlin before. So for those, there is the poem. It is a prose poem. It's one long extended paragraph. And I think this is a great example of how what's written on a page and what you recite are two things. They're two separate things. And when I interviewed Olivia Gatwood for my podcast, if you listen to her audiobook, which she recites, and then you read the book, it's two parallel experiences. And some poems have to, same words, but they have to be presented differently. So in terms of preparing this poem and thinking about how you'd read it, how did you approach that? Because you put in pauses and things like that, none of which is indicated by the way the poem is actually visualized. So maybe why did you go with this prose poem format? And then how did you think about the way to recite it?
Yeah, absolutely. The prose poem format for this particular poem and this particular story, it just felt right because it does feel like a story, a whole unfolding. So I just didn't want to have lines. I just wanted to give it all to you at once. And part of this poem is like, it kind of builds on itself in intensity. So I just wanted it to be like building on itself and no pauses and just like throw it at you. But for reading, it's not great for a prose poem because I would get lost. It's like, I'm definitely going to get lost if I read this. So this is my reading copy. So I actually broke it up into places so that I wouldn't just completely lose my spot and then not know where to return to. And so I broke it up kind of based on natural pauses. as a poet, I find that you do need to mark up your poem or change it when you're going to read it live, because otherwise, like, nerves kick in, and it's just really hard to remember exactly where you want to pause. And usually I've got markings, like, I'm not sure if you can see them, but I've got slashes to remind me to pause. I've got underlines to remind me to emphasize things. And it just gives you a little cheat sheet that makes it easier. And we could all use something that makes it easier to, like, get up in front of a crowd and be vulnerable and read something.
Now, Caitlin, before you ask the last question, I just want to read something because you'll enjoy this from the chat. Elizabeth chatted here. Wow, the tears are running down my face. Your presentation absolutely went to my heart. How beautiful this poem is on so many levels. So thank you, everyone, to the beautiful comments. That's really wonderful to read. So, Caitlin, you get the final question of this presentation.
Ooh, the pressure's on. I wanted to ask, you use the you pronoun in your poetry. You're talking to someone, it feels like you're talking to me as the reader and as the listener today. When you're writing these poems, are you envisioning a certain you, for example, or are you just kind of writing generally and hoping it finds the person that needs it?
That's a great question. It depends on the poem, because sometimes you is a very specific person that I'm like, I'm really talking about. And then sometimes, like in this case, you is the reader, because this was just a more general experience. Like, this is like what I truly believe in, like in the afterlife and everything. And I just wanted to, like, really flush it out and get into the feeling of it and the beauty of it. So I just wanted it to be the reader so that they could step in the shoes of the poem and then feel that experience with me.
Well, I want to thank both of you and do the mandatory. Please, everyone, hold up your books. Of course, we would love it if you enjoyed what you heard. Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, Surrender Theory, Barefoot and Running. Caitlin and Morgan, this would not have happened without you being willing to share your poetry and your voice. So thank you so much. We had a great turnout and people stuck around the whole time, so we didn't step in it. So that's very encouraging. I'm planning to do more Viewless Wings Lives events like this. Just a little plugs. The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast comes out every week, probably going to switch to 2 weeks shortly. It's a series of interviews with wonderful poets, including Safia El-Hilo, and Morgan is on there. Caitlin, I'm inviting you to be on the podcast too down the road. A.E. Stallings and Olivia Gatwood and many other wonderful poets, as well as roughly once a month there's a submitted poems episode, and that's for really poets that are unpublished or recently published, and it's an opportunity to have their voice heard in a unique way on the podcast. So go to viewlesswings.com, sign up for all the things, follow on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, everything. Follow Caitlin, follow Morgan, follow me. Thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful comments that were just a joy to read as this was going through. And there will be a replay available for those that couldn't make it, and that will be sent out in the next couple days. Thanks again. Goodbye, Caitlin, Morgan. I look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a blast.